didn't access it earlier, in the chat, I am uploading the handout for tonight. And of course, this will be recorded. So you'll get that notification. All right. So it looks like everything is activated. And yeah, we're all set. All right. Welcome, everyone. Tonight's session of Conchas y Café zine is obviously live on all the different live streams that we have, including YouTube, Twitter/X. We're also on Instagram Live, and that's still looks like it's still queuing up. But for the sake of time and all of the great poetry that is yet to come, we'll go ahead and get our lesson started. Tonight, as I had mentioned previously on the Google class, I'll be the one leading the lesson. And, if at any time you have any questions, whether that be here directly on Zoom, or if you have any questions in any of the live streams, you're more than welcome to raise your hand, reach out. Uh, you're even welcome to unmute. So, to get us going, though, as is customary of Conchas y Café, we have a quote. This quote comes from Michael Shermer, who was born on the 8th of September in the year 1954. He's an American science writer and historian of science. He's also the executive director of the Skeptics Society and founding publisher of Skeptic Magazine, a publication focused on investigating pseudo-scientific and supernatural claims. Y para traducírselo, esta cita de hoy viene de Michael Shermer. Nació el 8 de septiembre en el año 1954. Es escritor e historiador de ciencia, director principal de la Sociedad de Escépticos y publicador fundador de la revista Skeptic, una publicación dedicada a la investigación de relatos pseudocientíficos y sobrenaturales. Y aquí la cita dice: los humanos son animales, contacuentos busca patrones, y somos muy adeptos a contar cuentos sobre patrones, ya sea si existen o no. And in English, the quote is: humans are pattern-seeking, storytelling animals, and we are quite adept at telling stories about patterns, whether they exist or not. So, amigos, what do you think this is trying to tell us? What is Michael Shermer trying to, impart on us? Like I said, feel free. You can raise your hands. You can even just shout out your answer. Nettie?
So I think the world is very chaotic. So coming from a place of empathy, I understand why some people hold from belief. The world is chaotic, but in this sphere, sometimes we believe things that are not quite accurate.
Interesting. Sometimes we believe things that are not quite accurate. Yeah, that's very true. A hand I see from Julie.
Yeah, I have to agree with Neri on that, because I think we do sort of polarize ourselves in society at many different levels, with our friends, with the things that we read. It's like, it's hard for us to like go outside the boundaries of things that we don't know, or people we don't know. And so it's easier for us to just be in a pattern or see things as patterns that sort of relate to validating our belief systems.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase it. We use patterns to validate our belief systems. I mean, that's more or less what I heard. And I think that's pretty accurate. And that's also probably one of the reasons why certain stories are crafted in the way that they are to sort of reinforce our pre-existing beliefs, no? Abraham?
Well, I think it's just part of evolution, how we tend to look for patterns. Let's say I look for a tracks on the floor, and I assume it's a wolf or a tiger or so on, right?
Mhm.
And that also develops in like what you see in the clouds, right? You start seeing faces, you start seeing trains and so on, as well as people. Like here, probably they allude to it. Like you see a stranger coming your way maybe at night,
Mhm.
and the pattern suggests like, maybe should switch to the other side of the street, just to be safe, because you have that certain expectation that has been set by either things that you have lived or people has tell you, or the information the culture has infused in your mental being, right? And then you take the decision like the pattern says, might as well switch to the other side.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's kind of what Mojde is saying in the chat. They're probably patterns are a kind of comfort zone. Um, which yeah, I could definitely see how that holds true. We tend to gravitate towards the things that we know. We avoid the things that we don't know. The sort of experiences that we have can influence our decisions as we move forward in life. I'm hearing a lot of, the pattern side. What about the storytelling side? Right? How is storytelling a natural part of being human? Alex added in the chat, people seek. Seeking can lead to believing as well. Seeking hope, faith, love, etc. Yeah, it's a nice way to translate this or to interpret this. What about how adept we are at telling stories? Anybody have any thoughts about that idea? Julie?
Um, I think that we're in a storytelling society right now because of social media.
Mm.
And I think what's happening is that uh, there isn't a lot of expansion of thought, but more of a um, um, like a funnel leading down to, a funnel that's like sort of funneling all the information that you seek out, that's funneling down into you instead of the expansion of it, coming out and learning a lot about a lot of things.
Mhm.
So it's kind of we're kind of living in a strange time because it's really easy for us to like put something on social media, have people believe it, and have it go out to a lot of people uh, instantaneously.
Yeah,
So
it's
there's a
true.
lot more power with what we can do now than there used to be. Uh,
Yeah,
and that's not really necessarily a good thing because it takes a lot of information to learn something.
yeah, yeah. This is very true. And I think that your observation of the time that we live in being kind of like almost like a natural evolution of our storytelling power. Um, but yeah, to what end, right? Abraham?
Well, for me, it always goes back to like tuk-tuk, right?
Uh,
Basically saying people's gathering around a fire pit and telling how the day went, right? The dangers they encounter, or the food that they gather, right? Like which is a little different than I haven't seen animals going through that kind of storytelling as humans do. We tend to spice it up a lot. So we have become these masters of storytelling. Like we and Luis, and sometimes we gather and we talk about these, and like yeah, like before writing, before like that kind of formal storytelling, most likely it's like type of poetry storytelling, because the rhythm of rhymes and all that stuff will help people remember what's the next line of the story, right? Like it's the easiest way to put it into a story mode, right? So the rhyming of things helps a lot. And so we have then become writers, right? And then movies and then Netflix. And so I guess, yeah, as like humans, I give us that, like we're great at storytelling.
Mm. Yeah, I personally like that. According to Michael Shermer, we put stories, even if they exist or not, like we are naturally going to make up whatever we want to fit whatever we believe. And the thing that also I think stands out to me about this particular quote is that this is coming from a person who is the founding publisher of a magazine called Skeptic, and he's the executive director of the Skeptics Society. I mean, sure, the magazine investigates pseudoscience and supernatural activity, right? But the fact that a person who is probably a self-proclaimed skeptic himself, is talking about how we seek patterns and how we naturally come up with stories where they don't exist. I think that says a lot about his sort of mind frame when it comes to narratives and stories and what role they play in society. But I think it's also really important for us to understand really what is a narrative? How, as a society, have we come to define narrative? Y a ese fin les presento aquí pues la definición. So this is straight out of the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This is what a narrative is. This is the actual definition that you'll find if you look it up. And there's obviously narrative as a noun and narrative as an adjective. And the first, 1A is something that is narrated, a story or an account. Algo que es narrado, un cuento o un relato. Esa es la definición de narrativa como sustantivo. The second one, 1B, a way of presenting or understanding a situation or series of events that reflects and promotes a particular point of view or set of values. So kind of what we were saying before, we look for certain patterns to either create a story that reinforces our point of view or our values, whether that be as a society or as an individual. Segundo, el arte o la práctica de narración. Y para pues no olvidar de nuestra audiencia que habla español. En particular, la narrativa aquí, como dice, es una manera para presentar o comprender a una situación o serie de eventos que refleja y promueve un punto de vista o valores en particular. Y pues a eso yo creo que estábamos llegando a interpretar la cita. But again, I think that, this 1B definition is a really important one in relation to how we should be skeptical of narrative and of stories. But there's also, something very valuable to understanding what a narrative is or what it can be for us as artists, because in the end, that's really why we're here today, right? We're here to talk a bit more about how we tell stories, whether it be through poetry or through photography, which it is a very important thing for us to consider. And the adjective version of a narrative, excuse me, is the form of a story, right? Having the form of a story or representing a story or the process of telling a story. These are some of the tools that we can begin to look at, or maybe more better said, dissect, when we're looking and interpreting either poetry or photography or really any other form of visual art or literary art. Of course, tonight we're focusing specifically on the two, poetry and photography, so we'll stick more in that realm. But I do have some kind of thoughts in relation to this. But ¿hay alguna pregunta? Does anyone have any questions about how we're defining a narrative at the moment? No? All right, let's continue on. So the thing about narratives is that an effective narrative or an effective story, it does require what we see here, depth and dimension, aka layers. We can talk about layers in the sense of the visual. We can talk about layers in the sense of the metaphorical. But depth and dimension is ultimately, I think, the more accurate way of describing what an effective story does. Because effective stories, stories that really transmit what the author or the artist intends them to transmit, they'll typically add, these elements that make us connect much more closely with the subject of the narrative. In written artwork, as you see here, we have a couple of different ways in which that happens. Depth and dimension can be added to any written work of art with some of these techniques. These aren't the only techniques, but these are some of the probably most well known and the easiest to recognize. There's narrative arc or plot, meaning, the way in which the story is told. We usually start with what's called an inciting action. Then we'll have some exposition, which explains to us the background of why this inciting action was so important. Then we'll have a moment of climax where there's like a final battle or some sort of, moment of understanding. And then we have the denouement or resolution. El arco narrativo o el argumento de un cuento es básicamente igual. Sin embargo, el cuento, this is the narrative arc or the plot, structure is going to be fairly universal. There are going to be changes in the way in which a person might introduce us to certain ideas throughout their storytelling, but if we're looking at it from like a longer point of view, that's pretty much how most narrative arcs work. Character arc o el arco del personaje empieza con típicamente el quiebre del statu quo. Right? A break in the status quo is how we usually see our hero, our protagonist, our anti-hero start. Right? There's something that disrupts their everyday life, and then that forces them to either live with that disruption or cross the threshold. Right? Ultimately, accepting the challenge of now having to deal with this break in their status quo. A lot of stories will start that way. The easiest way to think about this is any kind of origin story for a superhero. Then there will usually be a period of learning, whether that be through mentorship or through, friendships that are made, which include, alliances with other characters or other people that have skills to teach the hero. And this is generally speaking, the character arc is generally speaking the hero's journey. The heroine's journey is similar, with its own kind of twists to gender identity and that kind of thing as well. But you'll usually see things like trials and tribulations, mejoras de habilidades, y luego la última batalla. That ultimate battle, that final battle, is normally going to be against the antagonist, whether that be an external force or an internal force. There's usually, in most stories that are structured in this way, there's going to be some sort of face-off, which then leads to the acceptance of this new identity and what would be probably described as an equilibrium. And then the stories will normally end with a new status quo for the character. And this equilibrium basically means that they accept every part of who they are, including their past, their present, and sometimes embracing their future. And then there's a conflict and tension. And notice here that I added, the three most common ways in which conflict and tension are shown to us in most forms of storytelling. It'll be either human versus human or man versus man, however you want to phrase that. It could also be a humanoid, so it could be like, I don't know, alien race or some sort of invading force from outside, but it is still kind of like a metaphor for the man versus man kind of trope. Then there's going to be, human versus nature or an environmental force. You could think of something kind of like any of the classic movies about like natural disasters, The Day After Tomorrow or 2012, those kinds of movies would be environmental forces and how, people try to cope with those things. And then in my personal, opinion, one of the I think most poetic ways of describing conflict and tension is the human versus themselves, right? The internal struggle. It's a philosophical or a spiritual conflict. So aquí tenemos lo que básicamente viene siendo los tres, yeah, Sharknado. Uh, maybe not. That's probably like nature and human. But
Yeah, that's the one I wrote for.
but these are the three average tipos de conflicto o tensión. Y como dije, para mí el más poético típicamente es el ser humano contra sí mismo. So, um, any questions so far, or any observations, anything that I missed that you also typically see in creating depth and dimension to any kind of story? Also, don't sleep on the Sharknadoes and the cocaine bears of the world.
Oh, you have seen that one? Huh.
I haven't seen that one, but like
I
they
want to
tell
see
stories.
the Coke Bear, or what was it?
Cocaine bear,
Yeah, it's a true story.
sort of.
It happened.
I didn't know that.
Nettie, do you have a question or comment?
I have a question.
Mhm.
It's usually with the character arc because I mean there's a gray area between having an arc and not having an arc. And what I mean by that is what happens at the end. Does the character changes at all or changes some, kind of changes, or it just finds himself somewhere in the middle, or there's like a complete reversal? Like,
Hmm.
what defines an arc and what doesn't define an arc?
That's a good question. And it's a little bit hard to hear you, but I think I got what you were asking is what is the definition of a character arc? Sometimes you'll see character arcs where it's not the main character who changes, but everyone around them who changes. And everyone around them will sometimes go through these same sort of challenges of like, they'll seek guidance from someone else, or they'll kind of turn their back on the protagonist, and they'll by the end have a different outlook on the overall changes of the environment as opposed to the changes of the individual. I haven't actually watched Ted Lasso, but from what I've heard about Ted Lasso, that is the kind of the structure that they use. Um, Another example that I could think of that uses that kind of approach to character arc is The Office. In The Office, it's debatable on who the main character is, but for the most part, we see Michael Scott. He tends to be kind of the same character all the time, and the people around him are the ones that are kind of adapting and changing. Where Jim and Pam, their relationship tends to be the one that is more like the traditional character arc. Abraham?
Well, I think one of the things Neri is asking as well is like, does it have to have a positive end towards the ending, basically?
Yeah, that's
But
true.
I think the growth doesn't have to happen to the character. For example, I think you had mentioned this one before in another time, Scarface, which I just watched not too long ago. It's like
Yeah.
the guy doesn't change, but
Mhm.
the viewer understands the changing of like, oh, this is what should have happened, or the changes for the viewer, not for the main character sometimes.
Right.
Or
You know, I,
somebody mentioned the Seinfeld as well. These guys they're the same idiots, and that was part of their plan. Their plan was, let's continue the characters. They're not gonna have any growth. They're just
mhm.
gonna continue being, I sometimes assholes, sometimes just funny people, right? I like the show, but they don't change, and that
Yeah.
was purpose. And the people that's changing is mainly us by
Mhm.
viewing them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that would be more of the anti-hero approach, where the anti-hero kind of just turns their back on society and essentially says, I don't have to change for anybody, you know. Um the movie Scarface with Al Pacino, from the 80s, that is probably one of the best representations of how an anti-hero story goes. Because like Abraham said, we expect the hero, Al Pacino's Scarface to change, but by the end, Tony Montana is really the same person. He hasn't changed, just the clothes that he's wearing, the amount of money that he's wearing, that he has, like that's what's changed. And it's us, the audience, who are now actually rooting for him, who, is obviously a terrible, really fucked up person, Um, so like, yeah, that's a great example, Abraham. Thank you for reminding me of that one. See, River wrote in the chat, oh wow, I like that phrasing. The people who are being changed by characters that don't change are basically us, the viewers. Yeah. So that's different ways in which these sort of notions of depth and dimension kind of uh, are presented to us through different forms of written works, right? And obviously that translates over into film and other forms of media as well, which, coincidentally, we are talking about one form of visual art. So with that, hay que seguirle. En obras de arte visual, los estratos que agregan profundidad y dimensión incluye sin límite a la perspectiva. So one of the first things that we use, at least in terms of visual art, is perspective, right? That adds dimension and it adds depth in a more literal way, right? We can talk about what Abraham shared with us before, in the last lesson of the wide field of view versus a narrow field of view. That's one form of thinking of perspective. There would also be the angle, right? A higher angle versus a lower angle shot, or a painting that is painted from like the ground level or from the point of view of a child. Those kinds of things help us to establish a story, and it helps us add a certain amount of dimension to the story that we might lose if it was more of a direct representation of what we're seeing. Y luego también hay el primer plano, el segundo plano y el tercer plano. And the use of foreground, midground, and background is especially important in visual art, partly because it gives you, I think, more space to create, again, that sense of depth and dimensionality, but it also is an opportunity to create conflict and tension, which is why we have here the figure to ground relationship as part of these tools for adding depth and dimension. Y obviamente también en arte visual, sobre todo en fotografía, hay el contraste y la tonalidad. Right? Contrast and tonality are really important, especially in photography, because photography literally means the study of light or the capturing of light. So, we have things like color versus black and white, and those stylistic choices that we might make, but it can also be a manipulation of light and shadow, which in the next lesson, Abraham is going to definitely get more into. So just like a little teaser there. But then we also have the concept of negative space, or el espacio en blanco, versus textures. And texturas crean no solo como un tipo de contraste, sino también una tonalidad que nos puede atraer más. Or in some cases, textures can also kind of repulse us, depending on, what it is that we are trying to get our audience to get from the image. And then framing, framing kind of encompasses a lot of these other things. You can choose to frame a shot from a high angle, while also taking advantage of light and shadow. All of these things tend to work together to create whatever narrative we are trying to create through our selective image that we're trying to portray. And if we try to apply some of these things to photography, we'll also see in a lot of ways that they also apply to poetry. Because poetry and photography have certain, what I call unique limitations, right? Poetry can be pretty much anything, but in our understanding of poetry in most sort of areas of society, we understand that poetry tends to be very short, and it tends to have a very specific focus. And it's almost a hyper focus on detail. especially for us as writers who are interpreting poetry. Al interpretar la poesía, hay que hay que poner mucha atención en los detalles, because it's really in the details where the devil exists, as the saying goes. You know, the things that our audience are supposed to get are the things that we need to make sure we really treat with a lot of almost reverence in the work that we're creating, right? We want to elevate it. We want to make sure that people see it, or that we hide it in a way that is still accessible for our audience. That's where depth and dimension come from, right? It's from the ability to see on the surface as well as below the surface, understanding that a metaphor is a metaphor because it has a deeper, more substantial meaning. And that is where visual metaphor and literary metaphor kind of commingle, right? They share that same sort of space. So think of photography and poetry, especially when they're working together, as a form of a snapshot, right? All of these are going to be snapshots of a moment in time, a particular emotion in time, a particular way of being in time. So, any questions about these ideas, these concepts in visual art and depth and dimension? Or any comments, anything that I might have missed?
Do you think you could explain figure to ground relationship a little further?
Sure. So figure to ground relationship kind of refers to figure being the subject and its relation to either the foreground, the midground, or the background, right? We typically talk about the three different layers in an image. So, it could be like, think of something like trying to think of a famous painting, like the Mona Lisa, for example, right? The Mona Lisa, its relation, the figure of Mona Lisa in relation to the background, is that it's centered. It is the female figure is centered. We have the face kind of at the eye level, sort of centered in the frame of the actual canvas, and then it's framed itself by, if I remember correctly, by trees, and then in the background, I think we see also a like a small structure. So that relationship of, the largeness of the Mona Lisa in relation to the smallness of the structure in the background and the trees, that's the figure to ground relationship. That very deliberate framing is what's helping us, the viewers, really focus on the face of the Mona Lisa, right? That very subtle smile that is so famous. If you think of it in terms of photography, it could be the way that maybe a person is uh, maybe shown in silhouette and they're walking against a very bright background, you know. So that sort of relationship of, where is your eye going? That is where you can better understand, I think, how figure to ground relationships work. And if there's a lot of clutter, then you're creating a lot of tension in the image. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sure. I saw a hand from Julie and then Abraham.
So yeah, the only thing I'm thinking is not here is textures.
Mhm.
Because texture, they're there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Textures are really important
Mhm.
because they just bring so much dimension, so much more dimension to a photograph.
Yeah.
So yeah. And you
Yeah.
have it.
Yeah, it's there. But it's also in, like paintings and other forms of visual art too. I mean, we could think of texture also in the way that like a static screen might kind of interrupt our viewing of a movie, And if that's deliberate, then that's adding a kind of texture
Yeah.
to the story. Abraham?
This is for the figure to ground relationship. When I was studying sketching for environment, one of the things that one of the teachers told us was, go and check movies and break down a scene, put pause, especially a strong scene, and you still see, okay, did they put the character all the way to the back? What does that tell you? It's like amplifying the characters is small to compare to the situation, right? Or maybe it's lonely, right? Or it's a big and strong, right? Depends on where you put it in the stage. Let's say, right, that you're making a movie, right? And where are you gonna put the actors? Close to the camera, all the way to the back. Maybe looking at the sunset and comparing the scale of the person to the sun. All those things where you're placing your character, and it could be a horse, a brush, or whatever. But usually we'll take it for people, right? That's a good exercise to go check movies and put pause and see why did they decided to put this character in this place of the scene, right? I think it's a good exercise.
Yeah. Which also ties into framing too. Framing is very important in visual art because you could have a figure be at the very top of the frame, right? And by being at the very top of the frame, it's implying that it's above everything else. It could be off to the side or it could be dead center. And it's about playing with our focus, right? Where do your eyes go? In graphic design, we call that visual hierarchy. In photography, we could call it visual hierarchy, or we can call it figure to ground, right? So there's different ways in which we ultimately classify some of the same basic techniques across all the different mediums. And like I said, you could take a lot of these things and also apply them to literary work, right? Perspective is just simply point of view, right? What is the point of view of the piece of writing that we're reading? Is it a reliable character? Is it from a first person, or is it the third person omniscient, third person limited? Is it second person, right? What are the points of view? Um, Contrast and tonality there could refer to things like speech and the different ways in which people speak. And it can also be, maybe the difference between the types of characters that you have. You could have a character that is very clearly an anti-hero who goes against society, and they're, pitted against a character that is I don't know, maybe naive, right? And so those kinds of things will add a different level of dimension and depth to whatever work you're reviewing. So, again, what I like to say, and one of the things that a very long time ago I kind of came to in terms of my own art practice was that, poetry can really be a type of photography. It's like literary photography. It's a snapshot of a moment in time, of a feeling in time. And, I, at least for myself, began practicing very short poems that were specific to a moment that I might see. And I would try my best to describe the moment in every single way that I could think of, which, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but, you know, we'll see at least one result a little later. Um, what is this, Abraham? I was at the top of the world, king of the hill, versus there I was, an ant in the huge city. Right. So those are two very different perspectives from the first person point of view. Right. So here I have actually, and I think maybe, yeah, I'm gonna share it on Photoshop instead because we'll probably be able to see it much easier. There it is. All right. So this is the first photo that I have actually in our handout. Um, a quick little note on all the photos that are on the handout. All of these are my personal photos, and all of these were part of a 365 project. For those that aren't familiar with what a 365 project is, it's a project where you set yourself the goal of taking a photo every single day and sharing it with the world. So for a while, I 365, not 360. But yeah, for a little while there, I was really good about it, and I was actually posting these photos to my Instagram when I first opened my Instagram account. And this is one particular photo that I that I thought might help to demonstrate at least some of the things that we were talking about. Yeah, it's like a photo diary. Exactly. So if we look at this photo here, you know, what are the first things that actually draw your attention, right? What are some of the maybe tools that we just covered that you see happening within this photo?
Well, I see a jacket or something in the back.
Yeah,
That's like that's draws my attention right straight back there. Or oh, they're pants.
yeah, their pants.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's dead center, right? So that's part of the framing for sure. Abraham?
Just to break down on the terms that you mentioned before,
Mhm.
we have the framing of the container. It's
Yeah.
kind of closing the frame, so it's interrupting the whole frame. So it kind of gives you like, what's like tipping your eyes towards where the image is going, and
Mhm.
then the container itself is guiding our eyes to the pens because those lines are going down all the way down to the pens.
Yeah.
And after you focus on the pencil, because that's what gives you the like, oh, let me look at this is where my eyes is going, right?
Huh?
Then after that, I think I start looking a little bit of around and then into the textures, like
Mhm.
the terms that you mentioned. You start looking like, oh, that's fabric. This is the texture of the container, especially. I think that's where my eye tends to later go to, like
Mhm.
all those lines in the metal and the painting of things.
Yeah. So this one in particular, thank you, Abraham, for pointing that out. There's obviously the guiding lines or the sight lines of the container, kind of the way that the perspective is drawing our eyes down this way. And it does bring us in some ways to the center, where then we see this one unique type of fabric against, this texture of the container, I guess is what it was. I don't really honestly remember. But then there's also, the negative space, right? We have a very white looking doorway essentially here that is basically eliminating any kind of attention that we might place to that section, right? That all plays into the framing as well. Um, so and then of course the purposely keeping it in color is really to just kind of draw your attention to the blue, right? There's the sharing of the light blue of the jeans, and then the light blue of this container, and then we also have kind of like a complementary uh sort of reddish, brownish reddish kind of tone there. um and then yeah, this is I think a rock, which is kind of weird. It does look like a shoe. I didn't actually realize that it is. I'm almost 100% sure that it's a rock until I actually was preparing for this lesson. Um, but yeah, it's kind of an odd scene for sure. I believe I took this behind a restaurant. I was walking up to a restaurant from their parking lot, which was obviously behind the building. So it caught my attention. We'll definitely, you know, leave it at that. Any other thoughts or maybe even critiques that you might have for this? Is it telling a story to you? Is it, you know, if you were to add a narrative to this, what would that narrative be? I'll pose that question to you.
Who let the pants out? Out.
Yeah. Somebody out there walking around with no pants.
So I was looking up perspectives, that,
Mhm.
and it says they kind of describe what you're doing here in this photograph,
Mhm.
forced perspective,
Yeah.
because you're manipulating the space, the way we're seeing it, the size
Mhm.
and the distance of the objects.
Mhm.
So you're creating a sense of scale and depth.
Mhm. Yeah. So, uh scale and depth definitely are occurring. And part of the reason why I would suggest is because of the framing, right? The framing is really making our eyes go towards that center. We have this eave of the building there that is just kind of there. It's not doing anything. It's blocking our view, most of our view of the sky, so there's no distraction there. And instead, what we have is these sight lines, like I said, that are drawing our attention to this. And what's kind of nice about this bottom one is that, this line of the bottom of the container then draws our eye to this right here, which is, that like weird stick that's just kind
Yeah.
of there. So, it's yeah, I just thought it was a good photo.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's one. And then let's take a look at another one here. So this is a little bit more busy, but I'd like to hear from you. What are the things that you see happening here in this photo? Just what would the narrative be that you imagine is occurring here?
Somebody died. You know, I don't know, like there's trouble. There's, the fire department's there. It's in East LA.
Mhm.
So anything's possible. I mean, just like anywhere else,
Yeah,
but
yeah, but that is true. Abraham?
Well, just to emphasize, we're talking about like framing, right? I think the framing that I see in this one is just basically the rooftop, and it's basically give us the frame of the sky. The sky is becoming our frame. That's kind of encapsulates the bottom, and that's kind of where our eyes go. But it definitely changes from the first photo that we saw, because the first photo we saw, just because of the perspective, all those lines are guiding our eyes to the subject, which becomes the pants. This one, it's more of the environment. I don't think maybe the color of the ambulance would have made it the subject, but since the background's also busy and colorful, it just becomes a photo about the environment, not just one thing. Unless you want to say CNN Latino 63. And this is a commercial.
Yeah. Here, I'm definitely pushing the concept of foreground, midground, and background, right?
Yeah.
Here, the foreground is making it very obvious that, it's the fire engine EMT truck, right? This paramedic truck. That's where your attention is going to go more than likely, first, and then secondary would be to the color blue, right? Because it's so pronounced. And that's coming from, the background. Obviously, there's the sky, but then also it blends with the midground. And because the midground, this mural here is very, very busy, it's really drawing our attention there because of something that is actually very naturally human. It's the recognition of patterns, right? As our Michael Shermer said, right? We're looking for a pattern that is recognizable. What is more recognizable than a human face? The mural is definitely going to capture your attention because of that. And then, in the very, very sort of faint background, we also have these people here, which, may or may not draw your attention, but, there's obviously something going on in this little section here for the person that stops and really examines the photo. So, want to know what the couple is talking about? Yeah, they could just be hanging out, staying out of the sun, as they wait for the bus. Like, we don't really know,
Yeah.
because clearly this is, at least a public bench. Whether there's a bus stop there or not, I'll leave that up to you, because we don't see it in the photo. But I like that there is at least some level of storytelling happening, especially in our chat here. Um, you know, Eric added that the EMT is probably on a lunch break. So, it's a nice, simple little story, which is maybe true, maybe not. The faces in the mural are silent witnesses of something odd. Really like that, Nettie. And the skull in the mural also sets the tone. Yeah. So, the
Yeah,
associations, right?
uh,
We could start making associations at this.
yeah,
So, for better or worse, right? Patterns do help us get to a story, whether that story exists there or not. Um, any other observations that anyone has or comments that they'd like to make about this particular piece? Also, I don't remember if I mentioned it or not, but all of these photos were taken with an iPhone 5, if I remember correctly, maybe a 3G. So these were taken a long time
Can you zoom in the rim so we can see you taking the photo?
ago. I don't know if I'll show up in the room here, but let's see. Ah, obviously, I took this from the car, so yeah, I don't think you can see my car there. For anybody that isn't familiar with the east side, this is Soto Street. So, Soto and Cesar Chavez. That's that particular corner intersection. All right. So I've got one last photo here for you. And there's actually two versions of this on the handout, and we'll see why. So looking at it here as it is, what vibe do you get from this? What is the feeling of the photo for you in color? A colorful jail.
activity, activity, yeah, it looks like an active space.
Okay, yeah, an active space, right? Um, thank you, River, for that one. That definitely made me laugh. When I was a little kid, I probably would have agreed. I would have been like, yeah, it's jail. The quiet before or after the child storm. Nice. I like that, Astrid. And then Roots wrote, beat up old daycare in the hood. Abraham?
Again, I'm gonna agree with River. It feels like one of those schools that, come on, you don't have no murals. You need some coloring here. I mean, the playground's okay,
Uh-huh.
but I think this one it's more about the absence of the objects,
Yeah.
like a chair that needs somebody to sit on. This
Yeah.
Yeah,
one has these toys, and nobody playing with them. It's like
yeah,
Yeah.
they, they, this is the loneliness of it, like it's missing what the objects are meant for.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I really appreciate that interpretation, Abraham, because you know, this is what you got in color, right? You got that particular vibe, that particular sentiment, right? Um, and then okay, and River added, but it's heavy on the left, like a promise that's uncertain. Um, in terms of the framing, yeah, I mean the left-hand side of the photo is certainly much more busy in the sense of, we have a lot of objects there, right? We have some tree trunks in the foreground. In the midground, we have the what's it called? The jungle gym, the slide, and all of the other pieces of the playground. And then on the right, because of the absence of so much, we see, probably the tricycles, right? Um, so yeah, there's definitely a bit of playing around with the framing here. And then there's framing within framing too, if you want to get extra meta with this, and that the fence that's there is also framing specific sections of the photo. Um, and then there's an Asian feeling, the tree, the squares, the wood, the architecture. Good call there, Julie. Good call. Um, little side note, this was actually taken in Little Tokyo. And let's see, River added, the tree bark is a little vibrant, the green pops, but the walls behind are bland in front of a blue that pops more. Yeah, it's like the trees are looking over the fence, hoping to see the kids waiting for them. I like that. That's a very poetic little story that you got going on there, River. I really appreciate that. But again, you know, I think what prompted me to take this photo was exactly what Abraham said. And I do remember taking this one and very deliberately framing it in this way because of the absence, right? There was maybe something that you would have expected to see that was not there. So that for me, as the author of this, as the photographer, it created a natural tension that I wanted to capture. Again, just taking a quick snapshot, not using anything fancy other than just my simple iPhone. And so, in my sort of hope of amplifying my original sentiment as the author of this is actually how I presented it to the world. So I turned it in black and white. Now, what is the difference between having it in color and having it in black and white? The black and white, at least for me, creates those much starker contrasts in certain areas. And I do have to admit, I didn't originally use Photoshop to create this photo, to create this black and white effect. I used an app on my phone at the time that actually doesn't exist anymore for iPhones. So the coloration was a little bit different, but nonetheless, this is how I ended up posting it in black and white. So what do we get in seeing it in black and white?
The textures stand out more.
Yeah. Also like how Astrid wrote in the chat, the grouping of the trikes between squares suggests maybe a child feels left out of a group. Yeah, I like that. Yes. Um, and then River added, now that it's in black and white, it's way less hopeful than the first one, but way more flattened. Yeah. So here's where, color versus the black and white effect, for me, add that added sort of tension and conflict and maybe reinforcing the original narrative that I was going for. Abraham?
I felt like the color one, and usually I tend to go for black and white because of the contrast.
Yeah.
But this one, because the objects of our attention are more smaller, and they're, you can see them, but they don't represent as much of when you see them in color. You kind of give that vibe of a children's toy. The same thing with the blue of the playground, because you kind of lose the playground more than the color photo, because
Yeah.
it's already blocked by the tree. So without the color, it's a little harder to read it. So
Mhm.
it kind of flattens it. The other one becomes, like somebody said in the messages, more layers, because the colors are helping you define these features that are important in this specific photo, which are the playground. You're missing the plainness of it in this
Yeah.
one, and it
Yeah.
becomes more like, I'm gonna say, more architectural photo in this way.
Yeah. As you're speaking, I'm actually doing some small adjustments to the filter here, to the black and white filter, to try and bring out some of that the coloration of the tricycles. But yeah, I mean, in the end, like I said, I originally didn't edit this photo using Photoshop. I used an app called Picture Show that used to work for iPhones. Now it doesn't work anymore. The developer, I believe, stopped updating it. But either way, um, the black and white for me really did help me as the author of this. Like I said, try to add that extra emphasis of what is missing, right? What is not there. And the children not being there is kind of what really drew my attention because of the way that everything was just kind of left there. So I hope you all found this little review helpful because I'd like to share with you next kind of what was the result of these photos. So, not all of the photos ended up being posted, as part of the 365 project. Like I said, this one wasn't the one that got posted. It ended up being the black and white version that got posted. But to kind of add to this concept of, creating different forms of depth and dimension, imagine having this photo and then being presented with this poem right next to it. And it's kind of difficult to find poems that are pre-made, right, for things that are ekphrastic. So I had to write a brand new one.
I
You all are,
know.
yeah. So you are all the first to see this poem. So feel free to critique and edit, because this is obviously a first draft. But do I have a volunteer that might like to read it for us? ¿Hay alguien que se atreve a leerlo?
May I?
Go ahead, Neri. El que
Oh,
quieras.
just before I start, I love the way you make the breaks. Like, I don't know how you do it, but here we go. Silent playground. Where did the children go? Where have the laughs gone? Where do the minds exist that absorb molecules of words, that nurture and adore the creative curiosity of three-wheeled races and tricycle? Derbies, the minds that know sharing, inherently before grown minds say, no, that's only yours and it's your right to earn more without remorse for what or who it hurts. Where? Where did those minds go?
Thank you, Neri. Y en español, do I have a volunteer who would like to read it in Spanish? A ver, Abraham, te reto.
I'm going. Hold on. Okay, let's see. El patio de recreo en silencio. ¿A dónde se fueron los niños? ¿A dónde se han ido las risas? ¿En dónde existen las mentes que absorben las moléculas de palabras, que crían y adoran a la curiosidad creativa? De carreras de 3 llantas y los derby, de tricycles, de tricicletas o tricicletas. Las mentes que conocen compartir. Intrínsecamente
Intrínsecamente. Ujú.
antes que digan mentes crecidas. No, eso es solo tuyo y es tu derecho. Ganar más sin remordimiento por el que o quien dañes, ¿dónde? ¿En dónde se han ido esas mentes?
Excellent. Thank you, Avery. So, ¿cómo les parece? What do you all think of the narrative? What are some of the tools, the narrative tools that we discussed that I tried to use here that you might recognize? There's a little hint. I said one earlier that is probably the most poetic of them all. Texture of the breaks. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, River.
I think
That
that
is
you
the-
also started with the, I want to say, I wouldn't say conflict, but it's like the start of the story. It's like it
Mhm.
breaks down that there's something happening right now. It's ¿a dónde se fueron los niños? Like, where did the children go? That's how you start, which is interesting way of putting it. And later you start going into it.
Mhm.
So it's action the action element and the
Yes.
narrative. It's like that's where you're going right away.
Yeah. River also added the repetition of where, right? The word where does come up a few times. So adding in textures in that way for sure. And then creating a sense of conflict, right? This tension, I would actually call it more than conflict. Just asking questions. Have you ever noticed how asking questions can immediately make people tense up?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like a mystery. It's like a mystery. You're presenting a mystery right away.
Yeah.
yeah, and I was going to suggest that with along with tension, that there is a tension here, perhaps between like the author and himself, wondering like where in him, like where is that child within himself? Where has that gone? And he's sort of, or the person is that's being
Uh-huh.
that that's what's coming out in this poem from looking at this image.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Astrid. Yeah. I mean, that is honestly one of the intentions that I had for crafting this poem was, I wanted to try my best to present to you all something that really tried to focus on at least one of the three forms of conflict or tension that I described earlier. So if we go back up here, right, in written artwork, obviously poetry, you can tell a story through poetry, right? You can have an inciting action, you can have a certain amount of exposition, you can definitely have a level of climax, and usually will end on some form of resolution in poetry. Poetry that is narrative can follow this structure. The poem that I wrote maybe has a little bit of that. It might also have some of the like break in the status quo, and that, the question that opens us up, right? Where did the children go? That's challenging our idea of, well, where should the children be? Right? It's sort of just setting us up for a certain level of tension, which at the very end, it becomes, at least I hope, relatively obvious that this is a tension of the human versus the self. It's not so much about actually knowing or wanting to know where the kids are, but it's about, what happened to the idea of being a child, right? To the innocence of children, and how children are able to share and not be greedy. It's at least the poem in its intention is to at least comment on the value of sharing, and you know the faults of grown-ups in teaching kids to say, what, you can have everything that you want, you earned it, right? And it's only yours, without having to think about who or what you hurt to get there, right? So that was at least my intentions, and it sounds like, for some of you got that, as well as some of the other tools and techniques that came up. Abraham.
Also, because we're talking about like a perspective, for me, it gave me the perspective of the actual viewer of this scene. Let's say it's not a photo, somebody actually looking at this playground and start to think about it. So it becomes about this scene and somebody interpreting like the quote that you mentioned, like we look for patterns. So you start looking into the scene, right? And then
Mhm.
your mind start going to these questions, right? And then trying to, in a way, answer them, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. And I think that's where also, I was, yes, I obviously, presented you the photo first, and I told you, that this poem was written in response to this photo. So you have that benefit. But another thing to remember is that us as authors aren't going to be around forever. And even if we are still alive, it doesn't mean we're going to be there to explain to our audience, the motivations for our poetry. So it is also very useful to consider those things as you write your poetry, and, the function of a title. I could have used some sort of phrase from within here. I could have used like, molecules of words, and that could have been the title too. But by deliberately using this as my title, I'm essentially, as the author, telling you this is the mind frame and this is the place in which you should be putting yourself, right? It's a silent playground. Most people would generally understand what a playground is. And for it to be silent means that there is obviously an absence of play, right? So titles can definitely be a tool, as Abraham says. So, any questions so far or other observations about the poem? No? All right. Well, if there are no questions, then the only thing I have left to say is to really think about poetry and its relationship to photography as being snapshots, right? As I mentioned before, the sort of limitations, the very small box in which photography can sometimes function is very similar to the very small box in which we place poetry a lot of times. It's not always going to be the same, across the different mediums, but for most people, their understanding of poetry and photography is that it's a snapshot, it's a brief moment in time, and it's a brief experience that you're attempting to capture, whether it be visually or verbally. And so, with that in mind, your homework for this week is to photograph a location using some of the elements of depth and dimension that we talked about. You can use framing, you can use perspective, you can definitely use black and white versus color. You can really try to manipulate the space in the sense of, using your camera, whatever type of camera that might be, as a way to give us some sort of depth and dimension. And yes, the location can be in your house. You don't have to necessarily go outside. This is something that hopefully you would be able to do by manipulating either an open window, going inside or outside, or shooting through a window itself. So there's definitely different ways in which you can add depth and dimension using foreground, midground, and background. All of the different elements that we talked about. You can use any combination of them. Once you have that photo that you really like, then write a poem that uses conflict or tension as a technique for creating those narrative layers that we were talking about. Using conflict or tension in the sense of human versus human, human versus nature, or human versus self, right? Those are the three that we covered. And just to make it easier on yourself, I would suggest, pick one of those three and try to generate that depth and dimension through the narrative that you write in your poem. Does anyone have any questions? Human versus bear. There you go. As long as it's not the cocaine bear, Abraham.
Yeah.
All right. So
I,
any final questions? Was
I
there a
have a
question?
quick question
Yes.
about, because we didn't hear the other readers this time. I was just wondering about that. Like what happened to the readers that we were supposed to listen to this week? I thought we were going to listen to some readers.
No, I think you're confusing it with next week for the workshopping.
Yeah, so after each class, we have the review of the work. And since we didn't finish, we're gonna wait until the next review to fill those gaps. And
Okay.
yeah, so next week, we'll have the chance to hear the people that we didn't hear last week, plus the new ones.
Plus the new one.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna do both.
Yeah, we're gonna try to. We'll see. But
Yeah,
still,
I know.
we have time. By the time
this
this ends, we'll have a couple of extra weeks where we can cut up to that. But I prefer to give everybody the time so we don't have to rush anybody.
And when are we gonna have a party for the new release book?
I'm actually going to send some instructions to everyone using Google Classroom for the last issue of Conchas y Café for us to do a I called it a supercut, I think last time, where it's a compilation of everyone recording themselves performing. And we'll be celebrating it in that way using our social media as a way to to highlight everyone who participated.
But what about the poetry book?
Yeah, for the actual like the physical thing, it'll be available to purchase actually this weekend at the Pomona Print Art Book Fair.
Oh, cool.
So it's going to be officially launched at that event. It's happening this Saturday and Sunday. At I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the location.
Well, you have it in all your writings, so.
Yeah, it's in the Benton Art Museum at I think it's one of the Claremont colleges. I can't remember. I think it's Pomona College actually.
Is this
So
the same place like we went last time?
yeah,
Oh yeah, it's the Pomona College.
yeah, the Pomona College Benton Art Museum.
Okay.
So that's where the official like launch and release to the world is happening. Like I said, it is this upcoming weekend, Saturday and Sunday, and it is an event that is open and free to the public, and we'll be there tabling, selling the zines, helping to raise funds to continue offering these programs, this one and our others. So yeah, if you're in the Pomona area, come on out and say hi. And then as far as yeah, we'll be tabling. And then as far as like a in-person celebration reading, we're probably going to save that for the summertime when we have the other publications all released. So
Okay.
yeah. But yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for asking, Julie. Also regarding the workshopping, so again, next week we'll be dedicating our time to working in breakout groups, and you will have an opportunity, hopefully, to have your work reviewed by your colleagues. In order for that to work, we need everyone to really kind of be on top of it and send in their work. We're going to try Friday this time. So if you can send your work to your cohort, to your assigned cohort by this Friday, Friday night, then that should give everyone the weekend, so Saturday, Sunday, plus Monday, to review your work, see the photography, or read the poetry and come prepared to give you notes on Tuesday. After this Tuesday, if we see that there are people who are not consistently participating, then we might shift around the current cohorts a little bit to give more people the opportunity to have their work read within the cohorts. So there will be probably an update after next Tuesday on who your cohort will be. So, and thank you, Abraham, for dropping the link for the Print Pomona Art Book Fair in the chat.
Good luck at the fair.
Yeah, thank you. And have fun, everyone. Take the time to explore your surroundings. Again, the photo that you take this week does not have to be out in the streets. It could be definitely within your home, or within the exterior of your home. So it doesn't have to be anything like, going out and doing urban walks like I like to do for my photography. But have a lot of fun, really enjoy the process, and enjoy the writing afterwards. Sometimes that can be equally as fruitful as the photos themselves. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week. Stay warm, stay safe. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.